The fog came down slow over Akutan Island. It rolled in from the Bering Sea in long grey sheets, silent, tasting of salt and volcanic ash, and it settled onto a stretch of tundra where nothing moved except the wind bending the grass. Beneath that grass, hidden by the mist, lay a small marsh that looked from the air like solid ground. It was not solid ground. The date was the 4th of June, 1942. A single fighter came down through the clouds, low and slow, streaming a thin ribbon of oil. The pilot was 19 years old. His name was Tadayoshi Koga, and he was a petty officer, first class of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and he was flying a Mitsubishi A6M Zero, serial number 4593, from the aircraft carrier Ryujo. 2 hours earlier, he had strafed the American seaplane base at Dutch Harbor. A single rifle bullet, fired by a defender whose name was never recorded, had punched through the oil return line of his engine. Koga did what he had been trained to do. He looked for the emergency landing site. Every pilot in the strike had memorized it. A flat green meadow on Akutan, 25 miles east. A submarine waited off the coast to pick up survivors. It was the perfect plan. He lowered his landing gear. That was the moment the war began to turn. The meadow was a bog. The wheels of the Zero touched the surface and sank. The tail rose. The nose dropped. The aircraft cartwheeled once through the mist and came to rest upside down, and inside the inverted canopy, Tadayoshi Koga's neck broke against the framework. He died alone in a country he could not name. Above him, 2 wingmen circled. Chief Petty Officer Makoto Endo and Petty Officer Tsuguo Shikada had orders every Japanese naval aviator carried into combat. If a Zero went down intact, destroy it. Burn it. Strafe it until nothing remained. No enemy hands were ever to touch the aircraft that had won an empire, the Pacific. They banked. They circled again. They looked down at the shape of their friend inside the cockpit, and they could not do it. They lifted their noses toward the sea and flew home, and behind them, in a country of fog and marsh grass, the finest fighter plane in the world lay upside down and waiting. 6,000 miles east of that meadow, in a plain brick factory on the flat land of Bethpage, Long Island, another airplane was being born. The Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation had signed its contract with the United States Navy on the 30th of June, 1941. On paper, the machine was called the G-50. Later, it would be called the Hellcat. The men who built it were not aviators. They were welders and riveters and machinists. Many were women. Many were the sons of Italian bricklayers and the daughters of Polish shopkeepers. And they worked in shifts that never stopped, and the noise of the factory floor did not stop either. And every man and woman who bent metal in that plant knew, without being told, that somewhere out on the Pacific, a boy in a cockpit was going to live or die by the quality of their work. They knew what they were building against. Everyone knew. The Zero had begun the war with a record that no fighter had ever matched. At Pearl Harbor, it had swept the sky. In the Philippines, it had killed the American P-40. Over Darwin, it had gone through Australian kittyhawks like a scythe through wheat. Above Ceylon, in April of 1942, 36 Zeros had engaged 60 British fighters and destroyed 27 of them for the loss of 1. It could climb faster than any Allied fighter. It could turn inside than anything that flew. Its 2 20mm cannon could saw the wing off a bomber at 300 yards, and the men who flew it were not new to war. Many had fought in China since 1937. They had 500 flight hours before combat. Some had 1,000. They were the elite of an elite, and they were trained in a tradition that reached back to the samurai, and they believed, with the calm certainty of men who had never been beaten, that the sky belonged to them. Grumman looked at all of this and made a decision that ran against every instinct of aircraft design in 1941. They built a heavy plane, not lighter, heavier. Where the Zero weighed roughly 5,800 pounds fully loaded, the new Grumman fighter would weigh 12,000. Where the Zero carried no armor plate behind the pilot, the Hellcat would carry 212 pounds of it. Where the Zero's fuel tanks were bare aluminum, the Hellcats would be lined with self-sealing rubber that could close a bullet hole in seconds. Where the Zero carried 2 rifle-caliber machine guns and 2 cannon, the Hellcat would carry 6 50-caliber Browning M2 heavy machine guns, firing 4,500 rounds per minute between them. Bob Hall, the chief engineer, said it plain to his team. They would not try to outturn the Zero. They would not try to outclimb it in a slow fight. They would refuse to play that game entirely. They would build a plane that could take a hit, deliver a hit, and go home to fight again tomorrow. It was not a beautiful philosophy. It was an American philosophy. They put a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp radial engine in the nose, 2,000 horsepower of it, and they wrapped the machine around that engine like a fist wrapped around a hammer. But an airplane on a drawing board is only an idea. To beat the Zero, the men in Bethpage needed to know what the Zero could not do. And nobody in the United States Navy knew that. Not in June of 1942. Not yet. On the 10th of July, 1942, a lumbering PBY Catalina patrol plane droned over the Aleutians on a routine sweep. Its pilot was Lieutenant William Thies. He was tired. The weather was foul. He was looking at nothing in particular. Then, through a break in the clouds, he saw a shape on the tundra of Akutan Island. Something upside down, something with a red circle on the wing. The recovery took a month and 3 separate expeditions. The first team had no heavy equipment and failed. The second team gave Tadayoshi Koga a Christian burial in a small hill above the marsh and tried to lift the aircraft with ropes and pulleys and could not. The third team, on the 15th of July, brought proper cranes. They pulled the Zero from the bog. They righted it. They cleaned it. They loaded it onto the transport ship USS St. Mihiel, and by the 1st of August it was in Seattle, and shortly afterward it was inside a hangar at Naval Air Station North Island, San Diego, where American engineers began to take it apart. On the 20th of September, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders climbed into the repaired Zero and took off. He flew it for the first time above the coast of Southern California, and he came back with a report that would rewrite the tactical doctrine of every American fighter squadron in the Pacific. The Zero was not a magic airplane. It was a knife, and every knife has an edge and a spine. Above 200 knots, the controls stiffened until the aircraft could barely roll to the right. In a full power dive, the wings threatened to shed their skin. It had no armor. Its fuel tanks were flammable as paper. Push the airspeed high, keep it high, and the Zero became a slow-turning, brittle target that could not follow. The Americans copied that report. They mimeographed it. They mailed it to every carrier and every training station. Young men in Corpus Christi and Pensacola read it aloud to each other in ready rooms. By the time the first Grumman Hellcats began rolling off the Bethpage line in the autumn of 1942, every naval aviator in America knew what the Zero could not do. The Japanese did not know that the Americans knew. That was the first turn of the wheel. It happened not in a battle, but in a bog, and the boy who bought that intelligence with his life had been 19 years old. 11 months later, on the 31st of August, 1943, the sea 200 miles southeast of a small volcanic rock called Marcus Island was as flat as beaten pewter. 3 aircraft carriers rode that sea: USS Yorktown, USS Essex, and the light carrier, USS Independence. Rear Admiral Charles Pownall commanded the task force from the bridge of Yorktown, and above him, in the black hour before dawn, the loudspeakers began to call the pilots to their planes. At 4:15 in the morning, the first Grumman F6F Hellcats rolled down the deck of the Yorktown into the dark. Their exhaust flames were the only light. Above them, the brightest thing in the tropical sky was the planet Mars, red and steady, and it hung almost exactly over the target. Commander Charles Crommelin led Fighting Squadron 5 off the Yorktown. He was a 10-year veteran naval aviator, quiet, precise, a man of few words. On the Essex, Commander Phil Torrey led Fighting Squadron 9. His pilots flew with their gyroscopic horizons caged, because, in the rush of training and shipment, nobody had found time to repair them. Together, they were the first Hellcats to see combat. They came in low, over Marcus Island, as the sun broke the horizon. They hit the runways, they hit the fuel dumps, they hit the anti-aircraft positions. 4 separate airstrikes rolled across that atoll, and by the time the last Hellcat turned for home, the base was on fire from one end to the other. But something did not happen that day. No Zero rose to meet them. The Japanese had a handful of fighters on Marcus. None got airborne in time. The great duel, the reckoning that Grumman had built the Hellcat to fight, did not come. The Hellcat's combat debut was a strike against parked aircraft and men on the ground, and when Rear Admiral Pownall signaled his pilots that night, he told them they had marked Marcus so badly that Tojo would not recognize its face for a long time. He did not know. None of them knew. Not yet. The Hellcat had been christened in fire, but it had not yet met the enemy for which it had been made. 6,000 miles to the west, in the ready rooms of Rabaul, veteran Japanese pilots were still telling their newest arrivals what everyone in the Imperial Navy believed to be a simple truth of the sky. The Zero could not be beaten. They had 2 months left to believe it. 2 months and 11 days after Marcus Island, on the 11th of November, 1943, the great duel finally began. The place was Rabaul. Rabaul was not a base. It was a fortress carved into the crater of a dead volcano at the northern tip of New Britain, and by the autumn of 1943, it held the largest concentration of Japanese air power in the South Pacific. 5 airfields, more than 100 fighters on any given morning. Simpson Harbor below, where cruisers and destroyers of the Imperial Navy rode at anchor beneath the sky the Japanese still believed belonged to them. At 7:30 on the morning of the 11th, Task Group 50.3, launched from a point roughly 160 nautical miles southeast of the target. The carriers were USS Essex, USS Bunker Hill, and the light carrier USS Independence. From their decks rose one of the largest carrier airstrikes the war had yet seen. 29 Hellcats of Fighting Squadron 9 from Essex, Fighting Squadron 17 from Bunker Hill in Vought F4U Corsairs, 12 Hellcats of Fighting Squadron 33 from Independence under Lieutenant John Kelly, 12 of Fighting Squadron 6 under Lieutenant Commander Harry Harrison, 12 of Fighting Squadron 22 under Lieutenant Leland Johnson. Above them, the Curtiss Helldivers of Bombing Squadron 17 were making their combat debut alongside the Hellcats' first true fleet engagement. The Japanese were ready. Admiral Junichi Kusaka had been warned 2 hours earlier. His fighter director scrambled 68 Zeros of the Imperial Naval Air Service. Some rose from Lakunai, others from Tobera and Vunakanau. They climbed hard through broken cloud and turned east, and at 8:30 in the morning, over Cape St. George, the two formations met. There was no elegant opening, no feint, no maneuver. The Hellcats and the Zeros collided in the sky. For the American pilots, it was the moment the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation had built the Hellcat to answer. For nearly 2 years, the Zero had ruled this ocean. Now, above a green channel in the Bismarck Sea, 40 American fighters flew straight into 68 of them and did not turn away. The doctrine held: boom and zoom. High side runs, never turn with them, never bleed off speed to match their maneuver. Come in from above at 350 knots, fire in short bursts, and climb back out on the throttle of the Pratt and Whitney R-2800. Every American pilot in that engagement had read the report from a lieutenant commander named Eddie Sanders in San Diego. Every one of them knew that above 200 knots the Zero could barely roll to the right. The Zero pilots did not know that the Americans knew. Over the next hour and a half, the Hellcats and Corsairs claimed roughly 50 enemy aircraft. Post-war Japanese records, always more sober than American claims, would confirm significantly fewer. But the arithmetic of the day was still catastrophic for the Imperial Navy. Task Group 50.3 lost 11 aircraft across all types. Rabaul lost fighters, pilots, and something more difficult to replace. It lost the certainty that the sky belonged to the Zero. Down in Simpson Harbor, a Japanese cruiser took a torpedo. The heavy cruiser Agano was crippled. Destroyers took bomb hits. And in the ready rooms of Rabaul, the veteran pilots, who had spent 2 years telling their new arrivals that the Zero could not be beaten, were beginning, for the first time, to have their doubts. Somewhere off the coast of California at almost the same hour, Commander David McCampbell was drilling a new air group in the empty sky. McCampbell was 33 years old. He had been born on the 16th of January, 1910, in Bessemer, Alabama, the son of a hardware merchant. He had attended the Staunton Military Academy in Virginia, and then 1 year at Georgia Tech before winning an appointment to the United States Naval Academy, where he graduated in the class of 1933. The Great Depression had cost him his commission for a year. He had worked construction in Atlanta. He had earned his wings in 1938. He had been a landing signal officer aboard USS Wasp when a Japanese submarine sank her off Guadalcanal in September of 1942. He had watched 375 men die in the water around him and had lived. He was a quiet man, thin, careful, a pilot rather than an orator. In the autumn of 1943, he had taken command of Air Group 15, 3 squadrons of young men, most of them still in their 20s, most of them fresh from training bases in Florida and Texas. He drilled them without pause: gunnery, section tactics, radar-controlled interception procedure, night landings. He was not building fighter pilots. He was building a machine, while another young naval aviator, 2,000 miles away, was already doing the work. On the 29th of January, 1944, Lieutenant Junior Grade Alex Vraciu of Fighting Squadron 6 lifted off the deck of USS Intrepid and became an ace. He was 25 years old. He was the son of Romanian immigrants from East Chicago, Indiana. His parents had come from the Transylvanian countryside with nothing. He had graduated from DePauw University in 1940 with a degree in sociology and had earned a private pilot's license through the Civilian Pilot Training Program before enlisting in the Naval Reserve in October of 1941. He had trained at Corpus Christi. He had earned his wings in August of 1942. He had spent 5 months as wingman to Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, the Navy's first ace of the war and Medal of Honor recipient, and when O'Hare had gone down on a night intercept in November 1943, Vraciu had carried the lessons of that dead friend into every combat he flew. By late January, Vraciu had shot down 3 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers over Kwajalein in a single day. And on the 17th of February, 1944, he took off from Intrepid with a fighter sweep of 72 Hellcats bound for Truk Atoll in the Caroline Islands. Truk was the Gibraltar of the Pacific. It was where the Japanese combined fleet had anchored for 2 years. It held 4 airfields, hundreds of aircraft, and a garrison that considered itself invulnerable. Operation Hailstone changed that in 48 hours. The first wave of 72 Hellcats arrived at Truk in the darkness before dawn. The Japanese scrambled, roughly 80 Zeros, to meet them. What followed was one of the largest carrier fighter engagements of the war, and by the time Vraciu banked his F6F3 away from the smoking lagoon that afternoon, he had shot down 3 Zeros and a Nakajima A6M2N roof floatplane fighter. His personal tally stood at 9. Task Force 58 destroyed roughly 270 Japanese aircraft over those 2 days. It sank 50 ships in the lagoon. Truk, as a Japanese base, effectively ceased to exist. 10 days later, on the 27th of February, Vraciu transferred from Intrepid to Fighting Squadron 16 aboard USS Lexington. His new squadron called themselves the Fighting Airedales. He was, at that moment, the leading active ace in the United States Navy. But the story of what happened at Truk was not, in the end, a story about Alex Vraciu. It was a story about the men who were not there. The 80 Zeros that rose to meet the American fighter sweep on the morning of February 17th had been flown, in most cases, by pilots with fewer than 200 hours of total flight time. Some had fewer than 100. The men who had won the Pacific for Japan in 1941 and 42 were, by the winter of 43 and 44, mostly dead. They had died at Midway. They had died over Guadalcanal. They had died in the long green of the Solomons, campaign, 1 and 2 and 3 at a time, and behind them, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been unable to build a training pipeline to replace them. Before the war, Japan had produced fighter pilots with 500 hours of flight training before they ever saw combat. Some had 1,000. Their gunnery was surgical. Their instrument work was flawless. They were the finest naval aviators the world had produced. By early 1944, the training program had been cut by more than half. Fuel shortages had forced instructors to teach in gliders. Gunnery practice had been reduced to a handful of live rounds per pilot. Formation flying was no longer taught. Instrument flight was eliminated. Radio procedure was dropped. Young men who 6 months earlier had been students at technical schools in Kobe or Nagoya were being handed the throttles of Zeros and told to defend the empire. Meanwhile, Alex Vraciu had arrived at his squadron with 300 flight hours and 50 hours in type. He had fired thousands of practice rounds in the calm skies above Texas. He had practiced carrier landings until they were reflex. So had every other Hellcat pilot who took off from Intrepid that morning. So had every pilot Commander McCampbell was drilling in Air Group 15. The Zero was still a beautiful machine. Above 14,000 feet, the Hellcat had it beaten in almost every measurement. But below 14,000 feet, in a slow turning fight, a good Zero pilot could still cut a Hellcat in half. The problem, by the spring of 1944, was that there were almost no good Zero pilots left. There was one other thing. 2 years earlier, in the anxious months before Midway, a lean, red-haired Navy lieutenant commander named John Smith Thatch had sat at his kitchen table in San Diego and worked out a problem with matchsticks. He was a fighter pilot. He commanded Fighting Squadron 3. His men flew the Grumman F6F Wildcat, an airplane that could not turn with the Zero, could not climb with the Zero, and could not run away from the Zero. He had been given a mathematical problem with no obvious solution. His answer was 2 matchsticks. 2 Wildcats flying in loose parallel formation, roughly 200 yards apart. When a Zero committed to attack one of them, that pilot broke into a hard turn toward his wingman. The second Wildcat turned to meet him. The Zero, following its target, now found itself flying head-on into the guns of the wingman. Either the Zero broke off or it died. It was called the Thack Weave. Thack tested it at Midway on the 4th of June 1942, 6 hours before Petty Officer Koga's Zero cartwheeled into the bog on Akutan. He shot down at least 1 Zero using it. Every naval aviator who came after him inherited the technique. By the spring of 1944, the Thack Weave was doctrine. Every Hellcat pilot in Task Force 58 flew it. It meant no Hellcat pilot ever flew alone in combat. It meant no single Zero, no matter how skilled, could dictate the geometry of an engagement against an American section. It meant that the samurai tradition of individual combat, the code every Japanese fighter pilot had absorbed from his first day of training, was flying against a system that refused to acknowledge single combat existed. Japan built pilots, America built pairs. The pilots would run out first. By the end of May 1944, the campaign was moving toward its climax. The United States was preparing to invade the Mariana Islands. Saipan, Tinian, Guam, islands from which the new B-29 superfortress could reach the Japanese home islands. The Imperial Japanese Navy understood as clearly as its enemy did, that the Marianas were the last defensive line. If they fell, Japan itself came within range. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of the mobile fleet, committed everything he had left. 9 carriers, approximately 450 aircraft, his best remaining pilots, most of them still under 200 hours. Against him, off the coast of Saipan, on the morning of the 19th of June, 1944, stood Task Force 58 under Vice Admiral Mark Mitchell, 15 aircraft carriers, 956 aircraft, 450 of them F6F Hellcats. The Americans had learned to count. Now the Japanese would learn what those numbers meant in the sky. At approximately 8:30 in the morning, radar aboard USS Alabama picked up the first Japanese strike inbound. 150 miles out, 69 aircraft, combat air patrol Hellcats were vectored at once. They had altitude, they had numbers, they had the sun. Aboard USS Lexington, Alex Vraciu ran to his F6F3. He had trouble almost immediately. His supercharger was malfunctioning, which meant he could not climb above roughly 20,000 feet on full power. Worse, his ground crew had left the wings partially unlocked from their folded stowage position, and though they were locked mechanically enough to fly, the aircraft handled strangely. Then his windshield was smeared with oil from a leaking engine seal. He should have turned back. He did not turn back. He caught the Japanese formation at roughly 18,000 feet, 6 Yokosuka D4Y Judy dive bombers. He rolled in on the trailing aircraft and squeezed the trigger of his 6 Browning M2 heavy machine guns. The Judy exploded. He climbed. He rolled. He came down again. A second Judy dropped a wing and fell burning. He climbed. He rolled. Down again. A third came apart in midair. Down again. A fourth caught fire in its port engine and spun toward the sea. Down. A fifth. Down. A sixth. In 8 minutes, using 360 rounds of ammunition from a load of 2,400, Alexander Vraciu of East Chicago, Indiana, shot down 6 Yokosuka D4Y Judy dive bombers. When he landed on Lexington later that day, he was photographed on the flight deck holding up 6 fingers. The photograph would run in Life magazine. It would be reproduced in newspapers across the United States. It would become one of the defining images of the Pacific War. He was not the highest scorer on that day. Elsewhere in the same battle, at almost the same hour, Commander David McCampbell of Air Group 15 lifted off USS Essex, leading a formation of Hellcats vectored against a second Japanese strike. He shot down 5 Yokosuka D4Y Judys in the initial engagement. He returned to Essex, refueled, rearmed, and launched again that afternoon over Guam. He shot down 2 Mitsubishi Zeros, 7 aircraft in a single day. David McCampbell had become an ace in a day for the first time. By dusk on the 19th of June, Task Force 58 had shot down approximately 346 Japanese carrier aircraft. American losses across all causes were fewer than 30. American pilots in their ready rooms that evening, still shaking from the adrenaline of their morning combat, coined a phrase that would enter the history books. They called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Aboard the Japanese carriers of Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet, the survivors landed 1 and 2 at a time. There were not many. Ozawa waited through the night for aircraft that did not come home. American submarines torpedoed and sank the fleet carrier Taiho and the fleet carrier Shokaku, the latter a veteran of Pearl Harbor. On the 20th of June, an American strike caught the retreating Japanese fleet at extreme range and sank a third carrier, Hio, and damaged two more. Ozawa withdrew what was left. He had begun the operation with 9 carriers and roughly 450 aircraft. He returned to Japan with 6 carriers and approximately 35 aircraft. The Imperial Japanese Navy's Carrier Air Arm, the force that had struck Pearl Harbor 30 months earlier, had ceased to exist as a fighting arm in a single day. They would not rebuild it in time. 6,000 miles east of Saipan, in Bethpage, Long Island, the assembly lines at Grumman kept moving. In June of 1944 alone, the Bethpage plant delivered more than 600 F6F Hellcats. The Japanese aircraft industry, for the entire calendar year of 1944, would produce 5,000 fighters of all types. In that same year, the United States would produce more than 35,000 fighters. The pilots would run out first, then the fuel would run out, then the aircraft, then the carriers, then the war. 5 days after Alex Vraciu held up 6 fingers on the flight deck of Lexington, on the 24th of June, 1944, 57, Zeros lifted off the ash of an airfield on a small volcanic island called Iwo Jima. In the seat of one of them, an aging warrant officer with a lost right eye and a fierce will to remain in the war banked north toward an approaching American task force. His name was Saburo Sakai. He did not know, yet, what he was about to fly into. Iwo Jima. The 24th of June, 1944. 5 days after the Great Slaughter over the Philippine Sea. The volcanic ash rose from the airfield in pale clouds as the Zeros started their engines one by one. 57 of them. It was almost every fighter the Yokosuka Air Wing had left on the island. Somewhere over the horizon, the American task force was closing again, and the young pilots in their cockpits, most of them with fewer than 200 flight hours, waited for the order to lift off and die. Among them, in a battered A6M5, sat a man who did not belong to their generation. Warrant Officer Saburo Sakai was 27 years old. His right eye was gone. He had lost it over Guadalcanal on the 7th of August, 1942, when a burst of American gunfire had opened his skull and left him half-blind and paralyzed on one side of his body, and he had somehow flown 560 miles back to Rabaul on will alone. The surgeons in Japan had operated without anesthesia. He had spent a year training new pilots, watching them arrive younger and less prepared each month, and he had asked again and again to be sent back to combat. They had granted his request in April. Now he taxied out into the ash. The engines coughed. The formation rose over Iwo Jima and turned north into the empty sea. He saw them at a distance he could no longer judge well. 15 aircraft, gathering to the east, at his altitude, the sun behind them. He looked with his one eye, and he saw the sun glinting on wings, and he thought, at first glance, that they were Zeros. He turned toward them. He raised one hand in the recognition signal every Japanese pilot knew. None of them answered. They were Hellcats, F6 F3s from USS Hornet and USS Bataan. And by the time Sakai understood that, he was already inside the formation of the enemy. What followed no camera recorded. He rolled, and he skidded, and he broke again. He timed each gunnery pass by the sound of the wind and the tremor of his own airframe because he could no longer see to his right at all. He had 200 combats behind him. He knew every trick a fighter airplane could perform, and for 20 minutes he flew through 15 Hellcats and gave them nothing to shoot at. He escaped into a low cloud and turned for Iwo Jima. When he landed, his ground crew ran to inspect the airplane. They walked around it once, twice, 3 times in silence, and they could not believe what they were seeing. Not a single bullet had touched it. Not one. Sakai climbed down from the cockpit and said nothing to them, and nothing to the officers who came to debrief him. And he sat that night in a barracks room, in the volcanic dust, with his good eye open, and did not sleep. He was the last of his kind. Between that day and the 5th of July, the fighter garrison of Iwo Jima was annihilated. Sakai survived because he was the ghost of a school of pilots that no longer existed in Japan. Behind him came boys with 100 hours and no gunnery. In front of them came the Hellcat, in numbers they could not comprehend, flown by men trained to a standard their own instructors had once dreamed of. 4 months later, on the 24th of October, 1944, the American fleet returned to the Philippines. Commander David McCampbell was 34 years old. He was the commanding officer of Air Group 15 aboard USS Essex. In June, over the Marianas, he had shot down 7 Japanese aircraft in a single day and become an ace in a day for the first time. Now, on this morning, off Leyte Gulf, he stood in the ready room with his coffee, cooling in his hand, and listened to the radar controllers call out a formation approaching from the northwest. 60 enemy aircraft bearing 310, Angels 20. The Essex could put up only 7 Hellcats to meet them. McCampbell climbed into his F6F5. His crew chief had painted the name Mincy 3 on the fuselage below the cockpit. In the second Hellcat sat his wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing. The other 5 Hellcats formed up behind them. 7 American fighters against a Japanese formation 8 times their number. They caught it at 20,000 feet. The 5 trailing Hellcats went for the bombers. McCampbell and Rushing climbed above the enemy formation and stayed there. They did not attack. They watched. The Japanese fighters, 40 of them, circled below in a defensive wheel, waiting for the Americans to come down. McCampbell watched them turn and turn and turn. He held his altitude. He waited them out. Fuel burned steadily from both formations, and the Japanese, low on their outbound run, ran out first. One by one, their fighters broke the wheel and turned for home. That was when McCampbell went down. He and Rushing dove out of the sun. High-side gunnery pass, exactly the way the doctrine written from a 1942 Zero on Akutan had taught them. Slash through, climb, do not turn with them, never turn with them, come back from above. McCampbell's 650 caliber Brownings fired in short controlled bursts. A Zero exploded. He zoomed, climbed, rolled, came down again. Another Zero shed a wing, climb, roll, down again. A Nakajima Ki 43 Oscar caught fire and spun away toward the sea. Climb, roll, down. He shot down 9 Japanese aircraft on that single mission. 7 Zeros, 2 Oscars. Rushing beside him, shot down 6 more. 7 Hellcats broke the back of a 60-plane strike and turned the survivors home without a single American loss. When McCampbell finally banked toward the fleet, his fuel gauge was reading empty, and his 6 machine guns had 2 rounds remaining between them. The flight deck of USS Essex was still fouled with recovering aircraft. He was waved off, He turned toward the nearest carrier that could take him. USS Langley, a light carrier of the Independence class, 27,000 tons. He caught the third arresting wire. The engine of the Hellcat coughed once and died from fuel starvations on the rollout. The deck crew had to release his tailhook from the wire by hand because there was not enough fuel left in the aircraft to taxi it clear. David McCampbell had become the only pilot in the history of the Fast Carrier Task Force to be an ace in a day twice. For those actions in June and October, he received the Medal of Honor. He was still climbing out of his cockpit on the Langley when 600 miles to the northwest, a Japanese transport aircraft was lifting off a runway near Manila. Aboard the transport, in the passenger cabin, sat a young man of 24 with a plain face and quiet hands. His name was Hiroyoshi Nishizawa. He was a warrant officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and he was, by his own reckoning, and by the belief of many who had flown with him, among the finest fighter pilots Japan had produced in the entire war. The day before, on the 25th of October, he had flown escort for the first official kamikaze mission. He had watched Lieutenant Yukio Seki dive a Zero loaded with a bomb into the deck of USS St. Lo and sink it. Now, on the 26th, Nishizawa was flying as an unarmed passenger on a transport aircraft, being ferried to pick up replacement fighters for his squadron. He did not carry a rifle. He did not carry a pistol. He sat in a canvas seat inside the transport and watched the coast of Mindoro slide past the window. The Hellcats came out of a cloud. They were F6Fs from Fighting Squadron 14 off USS Wasp. They took the transport under fire in a single pass. The transport, a Douglas-derived L-2D, caught fire, rolled onto its back, and went into the sea. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, whose own claim of 87 victories his country would never officially confirm, who had never been shot down in his own fighter, who had walked away from every combat he ever fought, died in his seat. He had no stick, he had no throttle, he had no gun, he was cargo. That was the shape of the war now. Japan's finest pilot, killed as a passenger by an airplane he never saw coming, flown by a young American ensign whose name history did not record. The Hellcat did not know who it had killed. It did not need to know. It flew home to USS Wasp and landed and was refueled for the next mission. 10 months later, on the 15th of August, 1945, the Emperor's voice came over the radio and the war ended. Saburo Sakai heard the broadcast in a barracks room in Japan. He was 29 years old. He would live another 55 years. He never flew a fighter again. In 1957, working with the American journalist Martin Kaidin, he wrote his memoir. He called it Samurai. It was published first in English, and Americans bought it by the hundreds of thousands. And in its pages, he tried, in careful language, to explain what had happened to his country in the air over the Pacific. The Zero had been a magnificent airplane. It had made Japan a great naval power for 2 brief years. But the Hellcat had not merely been a better fighter. The Hellcat had been the sharp edge of something larger. A factory in Bethpage that never stopped. A training pipeline that put 300 hours in a young man's logbook before he ever saw combat. A radar network that could see what the human eye could not. A doctrine written from a captured airplane in a bog in Alaska. Japan had built pilots, America had built a system, and the system had won. David McCampbell retired from the United States Navy in 1964 and died on the 30th of June, 1996, at his home in Florida. Alex Vraciu, the young lieutenant who had shot down 6 aircraft in 8 minutes, lived until the 29th of January, 2015. Saburo Sakai died on the 22nd of September, 2000, at the age of 84. The Grumman F6F Hellcat was retired from frontline service before the end of the 1940s. 12,275 of them had been built in Bethpage. They had accounted for approximately 3/4 of every aerial victory the United States Navy scored in the Pacific War. There is a photograph taken on the flight deck of USS Lexington on the 23rd of June, 1944, of a smiling young lieutenant, junior grade, holding up 6 fingers to the camera. There is another, taken years later, of an old Japanese man with one eye standing quietly beside an American veteran in a hangar in California. The Zero had made Japan believe for a little while that it was a samurai in the sky. The Hellcat had proved that the sky belonged to whoever could build the most of them, train the most men to fly them, and send the most of them home. That, in the end, was the arithmetic of the Pacific War. And it had all begun on a piece of tundra in Alaska on the 4th of June, 1942, when a 19-year-old boy named Tadayoshi Koga lowered his landing gear onto ground that was not ground.